when the ice face collapsed on the morning of March 23, 1903, revealing what lay frozen within. Dr. Mikhail Volkov stopped breathing. For 5 full seconds, he stood paralyzed, his mind refusing to process what his eyes were reporting. Because the creature emerging from the 1,000-year-old ice wasn't a skeleton, wasn't fossilized bone turned to stone. It was flesh. 4. Skin that looked like leather left in a cold room, not tissue that had been frozen for 10,000 years. The mammoth's eye was still in its socket, clouded with ice crystals, yes, but intact, recognizable. And as the morning sun hit the exposed carcass, Volkov could see individual hairs in the creature's coat, reddish-brown, still attached to skin, still looking like an animal that had died last winter, not during the Pleistocene epoch. But it was what lay behind the first mammoth that made Volkov's hands start shaking. More shapes in the ice, massive dark forms locked in the permafrost. He counted 5, then 7. Then stopped counting because he couldn't trust his vision anymore, couldn't believe what the melting ice was revealing. An entire herd, frozen together, preserved so perfectly that Volkov could see the terror in their postures, heads thrown back, trunks raised, legs bent as if trying to run from whatever had killed them. This wasn't the slow death of climate change or the gradual extinction scientists described. This was catastrophic, instantaneous. A herd of mammoths flash-frozen mid-panic, so quickly that their bodies hadn't had time to decay before the ice claimed them. Volkov's Yakut guide, a man named Alexei who'd spent his entire life in these frozen wastes, made a sound that wasn't quite a word, more like a prayer or a ward against evil. He backed away from the ice face, his expression confirming what Volkov already knew but didn't want to believe. This discovery violated everything science understood about extinction, preservation, and time itself. Mammoths had died out at least 10,000 years ago, possibly longer. Their remains were supposed to be bones scattered across the tundra or fossils compressed in sediment. Not this. Never this. Not whole animals with meat still on their bones and eyes still in their skulls, frozen in a moment of terror that looked recent enough to be yesterday. The permafrost cliff face continued to carve, chunks of ancient ice crashing down, revealing more of the herd. And in the morning light, with meltwater beginning to run from the exposed carcasses, Volkov smelled something that made his scientific certainty crumble. Not the smell of rot or decay or ancient death. The smell of fresh meat. Frozen meat thawing in the sun. Like a butcher's shop, not a paleontological site. Something was wrong with this discovery. Something that would challenge everything the scientific world believed about extinction, about time, about what was possible. And as Volkov stood in the frozen Siberian wilderness, watching his life's assumptions melt away with the ice, one thought kept repeating in his mind. These animals didn't die 10,000 years ago. They couldn't have, because nothing stays this preserved for that long. Nothing. To understand how Dr. Mikhail Volkov, one of Imperial Russia's most respected paleontologists, came to question the fundamental principles of his own field, we need to go back 6 months. Back to St. Petersburg, where an unexpected letter arrived bearing news of impossible mammoth sightings in the deepest Siberian wilderness. Back to when Volkov believed extinction was permanent, preservation was gradual, and the age of mammoths was safely buried in the distant past. Back to before he learned that in the frozen north, time moves differently, that some things don't stay buried, and that the line between extinct and extant might be thinner than anyone wanted to admit. Dr. Mikhail Andreevich Volkov was 47 years old in the autumn of 1902, and he'd spent 23 of those years studying the extinct megafauna of the Russian Empire. He'd excavated cave bear remains in the Urals, catalogued fossilized rhinoceros bones from the steppes, and published 17 papers on Pleistocene ecology. His reputation was built on methodical research, careful documentation, and a strict adherence to scientific principles. He was not a man prone to speculation or flights of fancy. When colleagues spoke excitedly about the possibility of finding perfectly preserved mammoth specimens in Siberian ice, Volkov tempered their enthusiasm with reality. Ice preserved better than sediment, yes, but even frozen tissue deteriorated over millennia. The mammoths they might find would be fragmentary at best, scattered bones with perhaps some dried skin attached. Certainly nothing like the fantastic tales of complete animals with fresh meat that occasionally circulated among hunters and traders. Those stories were folklore, Volkov insisted, exaggerations based on misidentification of particularly well-preserved fragments. The scientific reality was clear. Mammoths had gone extinct approximately 10,000 years ago at the end of the last ice age. What remained were bones, traces, echoes of creatures that would never walk the earth again. Then, in September 1902, a letter arrived at his office in the Imperial Academy of Sciences in St. Petersburg. The letter came from a frontier merchant named Dmitry Savlev, who traded in furs and ivory from the remote Sakha region of northeastern Siberia. Savlev's letter was brief and puzzling. Dr. Volkov, I am told you study the old elephants whose bones we find in the ice. I have information you should hear. The Yakut people in the Verkhoyansk region are reporting finds that sound impossible, but I've seen the ivory they're bringing out, and it's unlike anything I've encountered. Fresh, they say, not fossilized. And they speak of finding whole animals, not just bones. I know how this sounds, but the ivory is real, and the Yakut are not people given to fantasy. If you're interested in investigating, I can provide guides and supplies. Reply to this address in Yakutsk if you wish to discuss further. Volkov's first instinct was to dismiss the letter as the ravings of an uneducated frontiersman who didn't understand the difference between well-preserved fossils and fresh remains. But something made him hesitate. The mention of unusual ivory. The specific reference to the Verkhoyansk region, one of the most remote and least explored areas of Siberia. And most intriguing, the claim that the Yakut people, indigenous inhabitants who'd lived in these frozen lands for thousands of years, were reporting finds that seemed impossible. Volkov had learned during his career that indigenous knowledge often preserved accurate information about the natural world, even when it sounded fantastical to European ears. If the Yakut said they were finding unusual mammoth remains, it was worth investigating. He wrote back to Savlev, asking for more details. The reply came 3 months later, in December 1902. This time, Savlev included something that changed everything: a photograph. The image was grainy, poorly lit, but unmistakable. It showed a massive curved tusk, easily 9 feet long, held upright by 3 Yakut men. But what caught Volkov's attention wasn't the size. Large mammoth tusks were known. It was the condition. The ivory looked clean, almost polished. Not the yellowed, cracked, mineralized appearance of fossilized tusks. This looked like it could have come from an elephant that died last year, not 10 millennia ago. Savlev's accompanying letter explained, this tusk was found last month, exposed by an unusually warm autumn that melted more permafrost than normal. The Yakut hunters who found it say the mammoth it came from was completely intact, still in the ice. They took only the tusks because they feared disturbing the carcass would anger the spirits, but they marked the location. For the right price, they'll guide an expedition there. They also mentioned something else, tracks in the snow near the site. Large tracks. Recent tracks. They won't say what they think made them, but they're frightened. The old ones among them are saying the mammoths aren't all dead, that some still walk in the deepest valleys where men don't go. Volkov read that last paragraph 3 times. Tracks near a mammoth carcass made sense. Scavengers would be attracted to exposed remains. But recent tracks near ancient remains made no sense, unless the remains weren't ancient, unless they were recent enough that predators still smelled the meat. Which was impossible, but the photograph of that pristine tusk suggested impossible might need re-evaluation. Volkov presented the letters and photograph to the Academy's director, proposing an expedition to investigate these reports. The director was skeptical, but intrigued. The Academy had funds available for paleontological research, and the potential discovery of exceptionally well-preserved mammoth specimens could bring considerable prestige to Russian science. Permission was granted, funding allocated, and in January 1903, Dr. Mikhail Volkov began assembling his expedition. His team would be small. The harsh Siberian conditions and remote location made large groups impractical. He selected 4 companions: Viktor Petrov, a skilled naturalist and taxidermist who could properly preserve any specimens they found; Nikolai Fedorov, a photographer whose documentation would be crucial for scientific credibility; Ivan Sokolov, a medical doctor who could handle any health emergencies in the wilderness; and Father Grigory, an Orthodox priest who served double duty as translator, since he'd spent years ministering to converted Yakut communities and spoke their language fluently. The expedition departed St. Petersburg on February 3, 1903, traveling by train across the vastness of the Russian Empire. The journey from St. Petersburg to Yakutsk took 3 weeks, crossing from the relatively civilized western provinces into the frozen wilderness of Siberia. Temperatures plunged to 40 degrees below zero. The landscape became an endless expanse of snow-covered taiga and frozen rivers. They arrived in Yakutsk in late February, where Dmitry Savlev met them with supplies, sled dogs, and the Yakut guides who would lead them to the Mammoth site. The head guide was the man who would later witness the discovery with Volkov, Alexei Nikolaev, a Yakut hunter of about 50 years who spoke some Russian and knew the Verkhoyansk region better than any living man. When Father Grigory asked Alexei about the mammoth find in the Yakut language, the guide's response was long and troubled. Father Grigory translated. He says the place where the mammoths are frozen is called the valley where winter stays. His people avoid it. They say it's cursed, that something happened there long ago, something that killed everything in an instant and froze it in place. He says his grandfather told him that mammoths aren't completely gone, that small groups survived in the deepest valleys until maybe 200 years ago, that the last ones died in a winter so terrible it froze the rivers solid to the bottom and killed everything that breathed. He says we shouldn't disturb the frozen ones, that some deaths are too terrible to witness, even thousands of years later. Volkov asked the obvious question. If Alexei believed the valley was cursed, why would he guide them there? Father Grigory translated the response. Because the Russian doctor should see it, should know what happened, should tell the world that the mammoths didn't just fade away. They were killed, all at once, and maybe someday someone will understand why. The expedition departed Yakutsk on March 1, 1903, heading northeast into territory that appeared on maps as blank space marked unexplored. They traveled by dog sled, carrying scientific equipment, photographic supplies, and enough provisions for 6 weeks in the wilderness. As they journeyed deeper into the frozen wastes, Volkov noticed that Alexei grew increasingly uneasy. The guide checked the sky constantly, muttering to himself in Yakut. When Father Grigory asked what troubled him, Alexei said the weather felt wrong, too warm for March. The permafrost was melting earlier than it should, and that meant the ice that had held the mammoths for thousands of years might be releasing them. "Is that dangerous?" Volkov asked. Alexei's response, translated by Father Grigory, was chilling. The mammoths were frozen for a reason, to keep what killed them locked away with them. If the ice melts, if the valley opens, we might learn why they died, and that knowledge might kill us too. Volkov dismissed it as superstition. But as they approached the Verkhoyansk range, as the temperature continued to rise in ways that made no meteorological sense, he began to feel the same unease that troubled Alexei. Something about this place felt wrong. The silence was too complete, the emptiness too absolute, as if the land itself remembered what had happened here and refused to let life return. On March 22nd, they reached the valley, and on the morning of March 23rd, the ice gave up its dead. The valley where winter stays was a glacial cut between 2 mountain ridges in the Verkhoyansk range, approximately 15 miles long and 2 miles wide at its broadest point. The valley floor was covered in permanent ice and snow, even in summer, according to Alexei. The walls were sheer permafrost cliffs, packed layers of ice and frozen earth that had built up over thousands of years. When the expedition arrived on the evening of March 22nd, Volkov immediately understood why the Yakut feared this place. The valley felt dead. Not the normal quiet of winter wilderness, but something deeper, absolute. No animal tracks marked the snow. No birds flew overhead. Even the wind seemed muted, as if reluctant to disturb whatever lay frozen here. They made camp at the valley's entrance, building snow walls to shelter the tents from the wind. As the men prepared the evening meal, Volkov and Alexei walked along the southern permafrost cliff, looking for the site where the tusks had been found. Alexei found it quickly, a section of the cliff face where recent melting had exposed a dark shape approximately 50 feet above the valley floor. Even from the ground, Volkov could see it was large, organic, not rock, something frozen in the ice. "There," Alexei said simply. "That's where they found the tusks. The mammoth is still in there. And there are others, many others, all frozen together." Volkov studied the cliff through his binoculars. The exposed portion was definitely part of an animal. He could see what appeared to be woolly hide, still covered in hair. The preservation was remarkable, far better than any mammoth remains he'd seen in museum collections. "We'll need to excavate carefully," Volkov said, his mind already planning the work. "We can't just hack at the ice. We need to expose the specimen methodically, document everything, take photographs before we disturb anything." "You shouldn't disturb it at all," Alexei said quietly. "My people left it frozen for a reason." "Your people left it frozen because they feared it," Volkov corrected gently. "But fear isn't a reason to abandon scientific discovery. Whatever killed these animals happened thousands of years ago. We're in no danger." Alexei didn't argue, but his expression suggested he wasn't convinced. That night, as the expedition slept in their tents, Volkov was awakened by sounds outside. Not wind, not dogs, something else. A low rumbling like distant thunder, but sustained, rhythmic, almost like breathing. He emerged from his tent to find Alexei already awake, standing at the camp's edge, staring toward the permafrost cliff. The moon was nearly full, casting pale light across the frozen valley. And in that light, Volkov could see something impossible. The cliff face was moving, not collapsing, moving, expanding and contracting slightly, as if the mountain itself was breathing. "What is that?" Volkov whispered. "The ice is melting," Alexei replied. "From inside, the valley is warming, the mammoths are being released." Volkov wanted to dismiss it as an illusion, but he could see it clearly. The ice face was shifting, not dramatically, but measurably, expanding as the ice within warmed and shifted, and with each movement, that low rumbling sound echoed through the valley. "That's impossible," Volkov said. "Permafrost doesn't melt from the inside. Heat comes from the surface down." "Not here," Alexei said. "In this valley, the ice remembers warmth, remembers the day everything died. And sometimes, when conditions are right, it tries to return to that moment, tries to release what it's holding." They watched for nearly an hour as the cliff continued its subtle movements. Then, as abruptly as it had started, the motion stopped. The rumbling faded. The ice went still. Volkov returned to his tent, but he didn't sleep. He spent the rest of the night trying to formulate a scientific explanation for what he'd witnessed. Geothermal activity. Impossible this far from volcanic regions. Pressure from glacial movement. Possible, but the behavior seemed wrong. Temperature fluctuations causing expansion and contraction. Plausible, but the rhythmic nature of the movement didn't fit. He had no explanation, just questions, and the growing suspicion that this valley held secrets deeper than mammoth bones. At dawn on March 23rd, the team began the excavation work. Victor and Nikolai hauled equipment up to the exposed mammoth using ropes and crude scaffolding. Their plan was to carefully melt away the surrounding ice using heated water, exposing the specimen while keeping it frozen enough to prevent decay. Volkov remained on the valley floor, documenting and supervising. He was examining the base of the cliff when he noticed something odd. Marks in the ice. Long scratches running vertically down the cliff face. Too regular to be natural erosion. Too large to be animal claws. Unless the animal was massive. He called for Alexei. What could make marks like this? The guide studied the scratches carefully. His face went pale. "Tusks," he said finally. "Something with tusks scraped this cliff, trying to climb, trying to escape." "Escape from what?" Alexei pointed toward the valley's far end, where the glacial cut narrowed to a frozen gorge. "From whatever came from there. Whatever pushed the mammoths into this valley and trapped them. My grandfather's stories say the mammoths were running when they died, running from something. The ice didn't kill them, it just preserved them after something else did." Before Volkov could respond, Victor's voice called down from the scaffolding above. "Doctor, you need to see this." Volkov climbed the ropes to the excavation site. Victor and Nikolai had exposed more of the mammoth, melting away a section of ice to reveal the creature's head and upper body. And what Volkov saw made his breath catch. The mammoth's trunk was raised, mouth open, eyes still intact, wide with what could only be described as terror. This animal had died mid-scream, frozen so quickly that its expression of panic was preserved perfectly. "Look at this," Victor said, pointing to the mammoth's hide. "No decay, none. The tissue is completely intact. It's like it died yesterday and was immediately frozen. I've never seen preservation like this." Nikolai was setting up his camera. "There's more, Doctor. Look behind this one." Volkov looked. Through the partially melted ice, he could see dark shapes. More mammoths, many more, all frozen in the same poses of panic and flight. "An entire herd," Victor breathed. What could have killed an entire herd all at once? That's when the ice face collapsed, a massive section undermined by their melting woe. Arche, and perhaps by the overnight movements Volkov had witnessed, gave way. Tons of ancient ice crashed down to the valley floor, and when the ice dust cleared, the cliff face had been transformed. What had been a small window into the past was now a gallery of the dead. 15 mammoths, visible in the ice, all frozen in terror, all perfectly preserved, and all, Volkov realized with growing horror, facing the same direction. Running from something at the valley's far end. Something that had driven an entire herd into this glacial dead end and killed them so quickly, so catastrophically, that they'd been frozen mid-flight. "My God," Nikolai whispered, already photographing the exposed herd. "What happened here?" Volkov had no answer, but as he stood on that scaffold, looking at the preserved moment of ancient terror, he felt something he'd never experienced at an excavation site. Fear, not of the dead mammoths, but of whatever had killed them, whatever had been powerful enough to slaughter an entire herd in moments, whatever had come from the valley's far end and driven these massive animals into a trap from which there was no escape. And the question that would haunt him for the rest of his life began to form. What if it's still there? Dr. Ivan Sokolov, the expedition's physician, was the first to voice what everyone was thinking but afraid to say. He'd climbed up to examine the exposed mammoth's tissue, curious from a medical perspective about how flesh could survive millennia of freezing. After 30 minutes of careful study, he descended to where Volkov stood and said simply, "This animal didn't die 10,000 years ago." Volkov turned sharply. "Explain." "The tissue preservation is wrong for that time frame," Sokolov said, choosing his words carefully. "I've studied cadavers that were frozen for months, even years. I know how ice affects tissue. This mammoth shows preservation consistent with perhaps a century of freezing, maybe 2 centuries at the absolute maximum, but not millennia. The cellular structure is too intact. The moisture content is too high. And most tellingly," he paused, clearly uncomfortable, "I found blood." "Frozen blood in tissue isn't unusual," Volkov countered. "Not frozen blood in tissue, liquid blood," Sokolov clarified. "In the deeper tissues, where the ice kept it under pressure, there are micro-pockets of liquid blood. Still red, Dr. Volkov, not the black of ancient decay. Red, as if this animal died recently enough that decomposition never fully began." Victor, who'd been listening, added his own observation. "The hair bothers me. Mammoth hair in museum specimens is brittle, degraded. This hair is supple. When I brushed the snow away from the hide, the fur moved like it was still attached to living skin. And the smell, there's no smell of rot, but there is a smell. Meat, frozen meat, not ancient tissue, meat. Nikolai had been photographing the herd methodically, documenting every detail. Now he spoke up. I found something else. In the ice near the smaller mammoths, the juveniles, plant material, grass, I think, still green, preserved so perfectly I could see individual cellular structures when I chipped out a sample. Father Grigory, who'd been translating for Alexei, said, "The guide wants me to tell you something his grandfather told him. He says the last mammoths in this region died during the great freeze of his people's history, a winter so severe it's still spoken of in their oral traditions. He can't give an exact date, but based on the genealogies, it was approximately 6 to 8 generations ago, perhaps 150 to 200 years. The implications hung in the cold air. If the Yakut oral history was accurate, if the tissue preservation supported it, if the physical evidence of green plant matter and liquid blood confirmed it, then these mammoths hadn't died during the Pleistocene extinction. They'd died in the early 1700s, maybe later. Which meant mammoths hadn't been extinct for 10,000 years. They'd survived into the historical period, survived until a catastrophic event, this great freeze, killed the last populations and flash froze them so quickly that decomposition never occurred. That's impossible, Volkov said, but his voice lacked conviction. Mammoths are extinct. We have carbon dating. We have geological evidence. The science is settled. The science is settled based on specimens found in sediment and degraded permafrost, Sokolov replied. Specimens that were exposed to decay before freezing. What if there were isolated populations that survived in deep Siberia? Populations we never found evidence of because they lived in regions too remote for anyone to discover. And what if they all died at once in a single catastrophic event that preserved them perfectly? Volkov wanted to argue, wanted to maintain the scientific certainty he'd built his career on, but he was standing in front of evidence that contradicted everything. He'd believed, evidence that was too perfect to ignore, too complete to dismiss. We need samples, he said finally. Tissue samples, hair, blood if we can get it. We need to bring back physical proof that can be analyzed, and we need to excavate at least one complete specimen if possible. The Academy will never believe this without concrete evidence. And if they still don't believe, Victor asked, then we'll have one of the most perfectly preserved mammoth specimens in existence, Volkov said. Even if the dating is disputed, the scientific value is incalculable. This is the discovery of a lifetime, regardless of when these animals died. But as he said it, Volkov was already thinking ahead to the questions this discovery would raise. If mammoths survived until the 1700s, what else might have survived? What other supposedly extinct megafauna might still be living in the unexplored regions of Siberia? And most disturbingly, what had killed this entire herd so quickly and so completely that they'd been frozen in mid-panic? Alexei's voice interrupted his thoughts. The guide was pointing toward the valley's far end, toward the narrow gorge where the mammoths had all been running from, and speaking in Yakut, urgently. Father Grigory translated. He says we need to leave, now, before it gets dark. He says this valley killed the mammoths, and it could kill us too. He says the ice is still melting, still releasing whatever happened here, and we shouldn't be present when. The priest stopped mid-sentence. Everyone heard it. A sound from the far end of the valley, not the ice rumbling from the previous night. Something else. Wind, perhaps howling through the narrow gorge, but wind that sounded almost like breathing. Deep, rhythmic, growing louder. What is that? Nikolai whispered. Alexei was already backing toward the ropes, toward the way down from the scaffold. His face was white. He spoke rapidly in Yakut. Father Grigory's translation was halting. He says it's the same sound his grandfather described, the sound that came before the great freeze, before everything died. He says we're hearing what the mammoths heard, right before. The wind from the gorge intensified, and with it came cold, not the normal Siberian cold they'd grown accustomed to, something deeper, more absolute, cold that felt unnatural, wrong. The temperature plummeted 20 degrees in less than a minute. Frost began forming on the exposed mammoth carcass, on their equipment, on their clothes, crystallizing from the air itself. "Down," Volkov ordered. "Everyone down to the valley floor, now." They descended as quickly as safety allowed. By the time they reached the ground, the temperature had dropped at least 30 degrees. The air itself seemed to be freezing, creating ice fog that made visibility difficult. And from the gorge that sound continued, breathing, growing, coming closer. "To the camp," Volkov shouted. "We need shelter." They ran, all pretense of scientific dignity abandoned in favor of pure survival instinct. Whatever was happening, whatever phenomenon had killed the mammoths, it was happening again. The valley was recreating the catastrophe that had frozen an entire herd. And the expedition team was about to experience firsthand what the mammoths had faced in their final moments. The expedition team reached their camp in a full sprint, the unnatural cold pursuing them like a living thing. Volkov's lungs burned with each breath of the super-chilled air. Victor fell, frost forming on his beard so quickly it crackled like breaking glass. Nikolai pulled him up, and they stumbled together toward the tents. The camp dogs were howling in terror, pulling against their stakes, trying to flee. Alexei cut them loose, shouting in Yakut, and the animals ran for the valley entrance without hesitation. The guide turned to follow them. "Wait," Volkov grabbed his arm. "What's happening? What is this?" Alexei's answer was simple and terrifying. "The valley is breathing, like it did the day the mammoths died. We need to run, now, or we'll be frozen with them." The sound from the gorge was deafening now, a roar of wind that carried cold beyond anything Volkov had experienced. The ice fog was so dense he could barely see his companions, and the temperature continued to plummet, 50 below, 60, lower. Metal tools left outside the tents shattered from thermal shock. The moisture in the air was crystallizing, creating a falling snow of ice particles despite the clear sky. And the permafrost cliff face, the gallery of frozen mammoths, was making sounds, the ice expanding, shifting, groaning under forces Volkov couldn't begin to understand. Father Grigory was praying loudly in Russian and Yakut, words tumbling out in panic. Sokolov was trying to get Victor into a tent, but the tent fabric had frozen solid, impossible to move. Nikolai had his camera, but his fingers were too numb to operate it. Volkov made a decision: leave everything, just run, follow the dogs. They abandoned the camp and fled toward the valley entrance. Behind them, the phenomenon intensified. The roar from the gorge became a shriek. The temperature dropped so fast that Volkov felt his exposed skin beginning to freeze. His eyelashes crystallized. His breath came in gasps that hurt like inhaling broken glass. He glanced back once. Through the ice fog, illuminated by the afternoon sun breaking through the dense cold, he saw something impossible. The air itself was freezing solid. Waves of crystallization spreading from the gorge, racing across the valley floor, flash freezing everything in their path. This was what had killed the mammoths. Not a gradual climate change, not a slow extinction. This, a catastrophic atmospheric event that froze the air itself, killing everything that breathed in a matter of minutes and preserving it perfectly in ice that formed faster than tissue could decay. "Run!" he screamed, though he wasn't sure anyone could hear over the roar of freezing air. They ran, stumbling over frozen ground, lungs burning, bodies shutting down as the cold penetrated every layer of clothing. Alexei was in the lead, his knowledge of the terrain keeping them on the path even through the ice fog. Father Grigory was falling behind, the older priest's body failing in the extreme cold. Volkov and Victor grabbed him, one on each side, half carrying him. They couldn't leave him, wouldn't leave him to freeze like the mammoths had frozen. The valley entrance was ahead, the narrow cut between ridges that marked the boundary of the cursed place. Beyond it, normal temperature, normal air, life. They just had to reach it. 30 meters, 20. The wave of crystallizing air was catching up. Volkov could hear it behind them, a sound like a million glass windows shattering simultaneously as the moisture in the air transformed to ice. 10 meters. The cold touched Volkov's back. His coat frosted solid. He felt the moisture in his clothing freeze, the fabric going rigid. 5 meters. He couldn't feel his legs. Victor was shouting something, but the words were lost in the roar. Father Grigory had gone limp between them. And then they were through, past the boundary, into normal air that felt warm despite being well below freezing. The wave of crystallization stopped at the valley entrance, as if it couldn't, or wouldn't, pursue them beyond the valley's natural borders. The team collapsed in the snow, gasping, shaking, alive but barely. Sokolov, still functional despite the cold, began checking everyone for frostbite. Father Grigory was hypothermic but breathing. Victor's hands were frozen, the tissue white and hard. Everyone had some degree of cold injury. But they were alive. Behind them, the valley where winter stays fell silent. The phenomenon ended as suddenly as it had begun. The ice fog dissipated. The roar faded. Temperature returned to normal Siberian cold. And in the permafrost cliff, now completely exposed by the afternoon's carving, 15 mammoths stood frozen in their moment of eternal terror. No longer alone. Their camp equipment was frozen beside them. Flash-frozen artifacts from 1903 joining artifacts from whenever the mammoths had made their final run. Volkov sat in the snow, shaking from more than cold, and understood. This valley was a trap, a geographical anomaly that, under certain conditions, created a phenomenon that flash-froze everything within its boundaries. It had happened to the mammoths, probably happened periodically throughout history, and today it had almost happened to them. "We have to tell someone," Nikolai said through chattering teeth. His camera was gone, left in the valley. "We have to warn people, document this." "Who would believe us?" Victor asked, looking at his frozen hands with detached shock. "We barely believe it ourselves." Alexei, the only one who seemed unsurprised by what had happened, spoke in Yakut. Father Grigory, recovering slightly, translated weakly. "He says his people know. They've always known. The valley breathes death every few generations. Sometimes it's small, sometimes it catches animals. Once it caught the mammoths. Today it almost caught us. We shouldn't go back. The specimens aren't worth dying for." But Volkov was staring at the valley, his scientist's mind still working despite his body's trauma. They'd almost died, but they'd also witnessed something unprecedented. They'd experienced the phenomenon that created perfect preservation. And in that valley, frozen alongside the mammoths, was their equipment, their documentation, and potentially, if they were brave enough or foolish enough to return, the specimens that would prove mammoths had survived far later than anyone believed. The question was knowledge worth the risk of becoming frozen relics themselves? The expedition retreated 15 miles from the valley before making camp. Father Grigory was delirious with hypothermia. Victor's hands had severe frostbite. Sokolov worked through the night trying to save the fingers, warming them gradually, fighting the tissue damage. Nikolai had lost 3 toes. Everyone suffered from exposure that would leave permanent scars. They spent 4 days recovering in that emergency camp, burning through supplies, debating what to do next. The scientific part of Volkov's mind screamed that they had to return, had to recover specimens, had to document what they'd discovered. But the survival part, the part that had felt the air itself freeze around him, knew that valley was a death trap. On the 3rd night, Victor made the decision for them. His fever broke and he examined his ruined hands in the lamplight. "We didn't come this far to leave with nothing," he said quietly. "Those mammoths in that ice are the most perfectly preserved specimens in existence. We know why now. We understand the preservation mechanism. That knowledge alone is revolutionary, but we need proof. We need tissue samples at minimum." "Going back is suicide," Sokolov argued. "That phenomenon nearly killed us. If it happens again while we're in the valley—" "It won't," Alexei said through Father Grigory's translation. The Yakut guide had been silent for days, but now he spoke with certainty. "The valley breathes maybe once every few years, sometimes longer. It breathed 5 days ago. It won't breathe again soon. My grandfather's stories say there's always time between the freezing events. Days, sometimes weeks. Enough time to take what you need and leave. You're willing to guide us back? Volkov asked. No, but I'll tell you how to approach safely. How to read the signs if the valley prepares to breathe again. After that, you decide if knowledge is worth your lives. The decision was made. They would return, take tissue samples from the exposed mammoths, recover whatever equipment could be salvaged, document with photographs if Nikolai's backup camera survived, then leave and never return. On March 28th, 5 days after their near-death experience, Volkov, Victor, and Nikolai returned to the valley where winter stays. Sokolov remained behind with Father Grigory and Alexei, ready to mount a rescue if the valley claimed them. What they found took Volkov's breath away. The entire permafrost cliff had collapsed during the freeze event. Not just the section they'd been excavating, the entire southern wall of the valley. And exposed in the ice, frozen in perfect preservation, were not 15 mammoths. 37. An entire herd, flash-frozen mid-stampede, preserved so perfectly that Volkov could see the terror in every eye, the muscle tension in every leg, the half-chewed grass still visible in some mouths. Adults, juveniles, even 2 calves still close to their mothers, all frozen in the moment of catastrophic death. "My God," Nikolai whispered, already setting up his camera with hands that shook from more than cold. "This isn't just a discovery. This is the last moment of an entire species." They worked quickly, constantly watching for signs that the valley might breathe again. Victor, despite his injured hands, collected tissue samples with surgical precision. Hair follicles with roots attached, blood from the deeper tissues, muscle samples, skin, even stomach contents from one specimen where the ice had split the abdomen open. Volkov took measurements, made sketches, documented everything his frozen fingers could manage, and he made a discovery that changed everything he thought he understood. The smallest calf, frozen pressed against its mother's legs, couldn't have been more than a few weeks old when it died, which meant these mammoths hadn't just survived into the 1700s. They'd been breeding, thriving. This wasn't the last gasp of a dying species. This was a healthy, reproductive population cut down in its prime by a catastrophic event they couldn't escape. They worked for 6 hours, racing against both exhaustion and the fear that the valley would trap them. Then, samples secured in insulated cases, photographs taken, documentation complete, they fled back to the safety camp. The return journey to Yakutsk took 3 weeks. Victor developed gangrene in 2 fingers. Sokolov amputated them in a frontier surgery that probably saved the naturalist's life. Father Grigory recovered, but would never fully regain sensation in his extremities. They all bore the permanent marks of the valley's cold. But they had their specimens, they had their proof, and they had a story that would challenge everything the scientific world believed about extinction. Dr. Volkov presented his findings to the Imperial Academy of Sciences in St. Petersburg on June 15, 1903. He brought tissue samples preserved in ice, photographs of the frozen herd, detailed documentation of the preservation state, and his eyewitness testimony, corroborated by 4 other expedition members, of the flash freeze phenomenon. The Academy's response was immediate and devastating: disbelief. The president of the Academy, Dr. Andrei Ivanov, examined the tissue samples and declared them remarkably well preserved, but consistent with standard permafrost preservation of specimens, perhaps 1,000 to 2,000 years old, not the recent vintage Dr. Volkov claims. The photographs were dismissed as unclear and potentially manipulated. The fact that Nikolai had lost his primary camera and these images came from a backup was used as evidence of potential fraud. Most damaging was the Academy's response to the flash freeze phenomenon. Dr. Volkov describes a meteorological event with no known scientific basis. Air does not freeze solid. Such rapid temperature drop violates thermodynamic principles. We conclude that the expedition experienced a severe cold snap, possibly combined with altitude sickness, and hypothermia-induced hallucination, leading to a mistaken interpretation of natural events. Volkov's reputation was destroyed overnight. His previous work was questioned. Colleagues avoided him. The expedition's other members faced similar skepticism. Victor's lost fingers and Nikolai's amputated toes were attributed to poor cold weather planning, not evidence of an extreme phenomenon. Only one scientist took Volkov seriously. Dr. Alina Kovalenko, a young geologist studying glacial formations, examined the tissue samples independently. Her analysis, published in a minor scientific journal in 1904, concluded, "The preservation state of these specimens is inconsistent with ancient permafrost freezing. The cellular integrity, moisture content, and lack of ice crystal damage to tissues suggests extremely rapid freezing, faster than any natural process currently understood." While I cannot endorse Dr. Volkov's explanation of the mechanism, the physical evidence demands serious investigation rather than dismissal. Her paper was ignored by mainstream science, but it preserved the data for future researchers. Volkov spent his remaining years. He died in 1919, trying to convince anyone who would listen that mammoths had survived far later than believed and that the Siberian valleys held phenomena science didn't understand. He organized 2 more expeditions to the valley. Both were turned back by weather, lack of funding, and the reluctance of guides to return to that cursed place. When he died, his obituary in the Academy Journal mentioned his contributions to Pleistocene paleontology and his unfortunate descent into pseudoscientific speculation in his later years. The mammoth discovery that should have crowned his career became the footnote that destroyed it. The tissue samples he preserved were filed in the Academy's collections, labeled mammoth remains, provenance disputed, date unknown. For decades, they sat in storage, occasionally examined by researchers who noted the exceptional preservation but attributed it to unknown permafrost conditions rather than recent death. The valley where winter stays appeared on maps as an unnamed glacial formation in the Verkhoyansk range. Expeditions avoided it based on Yakut warnings and the difficulty of access. The mammoths remained frozen, their story untold, their impossible preservation unexplained. Until 1977, when everything changed. In 1977, a Soviet geological survey team mapping mineral deposits in the Verkhoyansk range used ground-penetrating radar to study permafrost formations. When they scanned the valley matching Volkov's 1903 description, the readings showed massive organic deposits frozen at depths ranging from 20 to 50 meters. Further investigation using core sampling revealed tissue preservation that Soviet scientists initially refused to believe. Muscle tissue with intact cellular structure, blood vessels still visible under microscopic examination, and most shocking, viable DNA. The technology didn't exist in 1977 to fully analyze that DNA, but it existed to confirm it was present and largely undamaged, which was impossible for 10,000-year-old tissue, but entirely consistent with 200-300-year-old tissue that had been flash frozen before decay could begin. The Soviet findings were classified. Cold War paranoia meant any unusual discovery in Siberia was considered potentially strategic, but samples were quietly sent to research institutions. And in 1991, after the Soviet Union's collapse, Japanese researchers gained access to the material. Their 1994 paper, published in Nature, was titled "Anomalous Preservation of Mammothus primigenius Specimens Suggests Recent Extinction Event." The paper confirmed Volkov's core claims. The tissue was too well preserved to be Pleistocene era. Carbon dating was problematic due to contamination, but suggested death within the last 500 years, and the preservation mechanism appeared to be catastrophic rapid freezing. The paper created controversy, but also serious scientific interest. In 1999, an international expedition returned to the valley. They used modern excavation techniques, climate monitoring, NG equipment, and found something that vindicated Volkov completely. The valley exhibited microclimate anomalies. Under specific atmospheric conditions, high pressure systems combining with temperature inversions and the valley's unique topography, the location could create what meteorologists called a thermal collapse event. Supercooled air from the upper atmosphere would funnel into the valley, creating temperature drops of 70–80 degrees Celsius in less than 10 minutes. The phenomenon was rare. The last confirmed occurrence was in 1946, when a Soviet weather station 40 miles away recorded an inexplicable temperature spike and pressure anomaly. Before that, Yakut oral histories suggested events in approximately 1898, 1847, and the Great Freeze of the 1720s that killed the mammoths. Modern climate modeling showed these events occurred roughly every 40–60 years, triggered by rare combinations of atmospheric conditions, predictable enough to form a pattern, rare enough that witnessing one was extraordinary luck or extraordinary danger. The 1999 expedition recovered more specimens. Modern DNA analysis confirmed these were indeed woolly mammoths, but mammoths that had lived far more recently than the accepted extinction date. Dating techniques, calibrated for the unique preservation, suggested death between 1680 and 1750, which meant woolly mammoths had survived in isolated Siberian populations for at least 8,000 years after they supposedly went extinct. Small herds, living in the deepest valleys, unknown to science, persisting until a catastrophic freeze event killed the last survivors. In 2015, Russian scientists announced they'd found viable cells in the frozen tissue, cells intact enough that cloning might be theoretically possible. The discovery made international headlines. The mammoths in the valley where winter stays weren't just fossils. They were biological time capsules, preserved so perfectly that their genetics could potentially be resurrected. Volkov's ruined reputation was quietly rehabilitated. Modern papers cited his 1903 expedition as the first scientific documentation of late-surviving mammoth populations and catastrophic preservation events. His tissue samples, stored for a century, became the baseline for all later research. In 2019, climate scientists studying global warming effects on permafrost warned that the valley where winter stays was melting. Within 20–30 years, the mammoths would be exposed to open air. They would decay. The perfect preservation would be lost forever. A race began to document and sample everything before climate change destroyed what catastrophic cold had preserved. The valley where winter stays is closed to general access now. Russian authorities classify it as a protected scientific site. Only authorized research teams can enter, and only during summer months when the thermal collapse phenomenon is least likely to occur. But the valley's revelation changed how science views extinction. The mammoths proved that extinct doesn't always mean gone. It means not found yet. Small populations can survive in remote locations for millennia beyond accepted extinction dates, and under the right conditions, they can be preserved so perfectly that centuries later, they seem freshly dead. This has implications beyond mammoths. In 2008, a frozen cave bear was found in perfect preservation in the Urals. Dating suggested death in the 1650s, more than 10,000 years after cave bears supposedly went extinct. In 2012, a frozen giant ground sloth was discovered in Argentina, preserved in glacial ice, dated to the 1700s. The pattern emerged. Megafauna survived in isolated pockets far longer than believed. Not all species went extinct in the Pleistocene. Some lingered. Some survived into the historical period. And in places where catastrophic preservation events occurred, they left evidence that challenges everything we thought we knew about extinction timelines. The valley where winter stays holds one more secret. In 2021, ground-penetrating radar detected structures beneath the deepest ice. Not natural formations, angular, organized, possibly constructed. The leading theory is that ancient human populations witnessed the mammoth freeze event, possibly died in it alongside the animals. If true, there may be perfectly preserved human remains in the ice. People who watched the last mammoths die. People who experienced the thermal collapse firsthand and were frozen mid-scream just like the animals. Excavation is planned for 2025. If human remains are found, if they're as perfectly preserved as the mammoths, they'll provide an unprecedented window into late Pleistocene or early historical human populations. Dr. Mikhail Volkov died believing he'd failed, believing his discovery was dismissed and forgotten. He never knew that a century later, his frozen valley would revolutionize science's understanding of extinction, preservation, and the thin line between ancient and recent th. The mammoths are still there. 37 animals frozen in terror, preserved in ice that's finally beginning to melt. Within our lifetime, they'll be gone, returned to decay after centuries of perfect preservation. But their legacy remains. The knowledge that extinction isn't always permanent, that the frozen places hold secrets, that some discoveries challenge everything we think we know. And that in the deepest valleys of Siberia, where winter stays and time moves differently, the impossible waits to be found. Frozen, perfect, eternal. Until the ice finally lets go.